Welcome to An Interview in History. Imagine a podcast that serves as a bridge across time, connecting listeners to the voices of history's most impactful figures. Each episode is a deep dive into the lives and legacies of these individuals, exploring not just their well-documented achievements, but also uncovering lesser-known facts that shaped their contributions to our world. From scientists who unlocked the mysteries of the universe to activists who fought for social change, each story is a testament to the indelible mark they left on society. This journey through history will not only educate, but also inspire listeners to appreciate the intricate tapestry of human progress. This week on An Interview in History, we're talking with Jefferson F. Davis, who was an American politician that served as the only president of the Confederate States from 1861 to 1865. He represented Mississippi in the United States Senate and the House of Representatives as a member of the Democratic Party before the American Civil War. He was the United States Secretary of War from 1853 to 1857. This interview takes place on March 26, 1889. Hi, Mr. Davis, and thank you for joining us today. Let's start at the beginning. Can you tell us about your childhood?
Of course. I was born on June 3rd, 1808, in what is now Fairview, Kentucky. My parents, Samuel and Jane Davis, were farmers of modest means. I was the youngest of 10 children, and my family moved to Mississippi when I was still a small boy. My childhood was shaped by life on the frontier, where hard work and discipline were necessary.
With such a large family, did any of your siblings have a strong influence on you?
Yes. My eldest brother Joseph was especially influential. He was well educated and successful. He took a keen interest in my education and career. He acted as a mentor, helping to guide me toward military service and later politics.
Speaking of education, where did you attend school?
Well, I was sent to various academies in Kentucky and Mississippi before entering Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky at the age of 16. However, my path changed when my father and my brother arranged for me to attend the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1824. There I received rigorous training, though I wasn't the most disciplined student. I frequently challenged the Academy's discipline. In my first year, I was court-martialed for drinking at a nearby tavern. I was found guilty, but pardoned. The following year, I was placed under house arrest for my role in the Eggnog Riot during Christmas of 1826, but was not dismissed. I graduated 23rd in the class of 33.
Well, that was quite a school career. After West Point, you served in the military. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. Like I said, I graduated in 1828 and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army. I served primarily on the frontier, including in the Black Hawk War of 1832. But after a few years, I decided the military life wasn't for me, and I resigned in 1835.
What led to that decision?
Love, in part. I married Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of General Zachary Taylor, despite her father's opposition. Unfortunately, she died of malaria only 3 months into our marriage. Grief-stricken, I withdrew from public life and became a planter in Mississippi.
That must have been difficult. Did you ever remarry?
Yes, years later, in 1845, I married Vania Howell. She is intelligent and strong-willed, and though our marriage has its ups and downs, we've remained together. We had 6 children, though tragically several died young.
Tell me a bit about your children.
Well, like I said, we had 6 children. Samuel Emery, born 1852, who died of an undiagnosed disease 2 years later. Margaret Howell, born in 1855, who married, raised a family. Jefferson Davis Jr., born 1857, who died of yellow fever at the age of 21. Joseph Evan, born 1859, but who died of an accidental fall at age 5. William Howell, born 1861, who died of diphtheria at the age of 10. And Vania Ann, born 1864.
That must be a lot of grief for you and your wife, losing all those children.
Yes, it has been rough, but we must go on.
Yes, very true. How did you transition from plantation life to politics?
My brother Joseph encouraged me to enter politics in 1845. I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Mississippi. However, when the Mexican-American War broke out in 1846, I left Congress to command the Mississippi Rifles, where I distinguished myself in battle. This military success boosted my reputation, and after the war, I served in the U.S. Senate and later as Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce.
Well, when the Civil War began, how did you become president of the Confederacy?
I had actually hoped to stay out of it, preferred a military command. However, I was well known as a strong advocate for states' rights and the Southern cause. When the Confederacy was formed in 1861, I was chosen as its first and only president. I reluctantly accepted, believing it was my duty.
What were your main challenges as Confederate president?
The war itself, of course. The Confederacy lacked the resources of the North and struggled with supply shortages, political divisions, and internal strife. My leadership was often criticized, particularly my decision to centralize power and my clashes with the other Confederate leaders. But despite this, I remain committed to the cause.
Mr. Davis, in your opinion, what was the root cause for the split between the North and the South?
That is a question with many answers. But at its core, the division between the North and the South arose from fundamental differences in our economies, cultures, and views on government. The North embraced industrialization and a stronger central government, while the South remained largely agrarian, valuing states' rights and local sovereignty. But if we are to be direct, the greatest source of the conflict was the issue of slavery. The North sought to restrict its expansion, while the South saw it as an attack on its economic system and way of life. Many in the South believed that each state had the right to govern itself, including the right to allow slavery if its people so chose. The federal government's increasing interference, particularly with the election of Abraham Lincoln, convinced Southern states that their rights were in jeopardy. To us, it was a fight for self-governance and independence. To the North, it was a fight to preserve the Union. Once war began, those differences became irreconcilable.
What was your relationship like with President Lincoln?
President Lincoln and I had little direct interaction, though we were political opponents long before the war. We both served in Congress, though not at the same time, and we had very different views on the role of the federal government. I respected Lincoln as a skilled politician and leader, though I strongly opposed his policies. He, in turn, saw me as a traitor to the Union. We never met face to face during the war, and all communications between us were through intermediaries. There were times when attempts were made at negotiation, but Lincoln insisted on reunion as a precondition, which the Confederacy could not accept. After his assassination, I expressed regret, as I believed his death would only bring more hardship to the South. Our relationship was one of ideological opposition, but I never underestimated his resolve. Didn't Lincoln offer you clemency at one point? No. President Lincoln never offered me clemency. During the war, Lincoln made it clear that he saw the Confederacy as a rebellion, and while he offered amnesty to many Southerners who would swear allegiance to the Union, that did not get extended to me. After the war, I was captured and imprisoned at Fort Monroe in 1865. By then, Lincoln had been assassinated, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, took a much harsher stance towards Confederate leaders. There were discussions about putting me on trial for treason, but it never came to pass. I remained in prison for 2 years before being released on bail, thanks to support from both Northern and Southern figures. Ultimately, I was never formally pardoned by the U.S. government. What were your thoughts when the Confederacy fell? It was devastating. Though I was never tried for treason, my time in captivity was difficult, and, again, I was eventually released on bail thanks to prominent Northerners who advocated clemency. Tell us how you were impacted at the end of the Civil War. The Union Army broke through the Confederate trench lines at the end of March, forcing Lee to withdraw and abandon Richmond, Virginia. I evacuated my family, which included Jim Limber, a free black orphan we briefly adopted. On April 2nd, my cabinet and I escaped by rail to Danville, Virginia. I issued a proclamation on April 4th, encouraging the people of the Confederacy to continue resistance, but Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th. My cabinet and I headed to Greensboro, North Carolina, where we met with Joseph Johnson and North Carolina Governor Zebulon Vance. I wanted to cross the Mississippi River and continue the war, but my generals stated that they did not have the forces. I gave Johnson authorization to negotiate the surrender of my army, but I headed south to carry on the fight. But that did not turn out very well. When Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, the Union government implicated me, and a bounty of $100,000 was put on my head. On May 2nd, I met with Secretary of War Breckinridge and Bragg in Abbeville, Georgia, to see if they could pull together an army. They said they could not. On May 5th, I met with the remainder of my cabinet in Washington, Georgia, and officially dissolved the Confederate government. I moved on, hoping to join Kirby Smith's army across the Mississippi. Then on May 9th, Union soldiers found my encampment near Irwinville, Georgia. I tried to evade them, but I was captured wearing a loose-sleeved cloak and covering my head with a black shawl, which gave rise to depictions of me in political cartoons fleeing in women's clothes. That's truly amazing. How have you been spending your later years? I lived quietly for the most part, and I wrote The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government to defend the Confederate cause and my role in it. I've spent my final years in Mississippi and Louisiana. Looking back, how do you feel about your legacy? History judges all men differently. I believe in the right of states to govern themselves, but the war resulted in great suffering. Some see me as a patriot, others as a traitor. I can only say that I acted according to my convictions. Thank you for your time, Mr. Davis. The pleasure was all mine. In November 1889,
Davis embarked on a steamboat in New Orleans in a cold rain. He fell ill during the trip, but refused to send for a doctor. An employee sent a telegram to Varnia, who came to get him. Davis was diagnosed with acute bronchitis, complicated by malaria. When he returned to New Orleans, Davis's doctor, Stamford E. Chalil, pronounced him too ill to travel further. He was taken to the home of Charles Erasmus Fenner, the son-in-law of his friend J. M. Payne, where he died at 12:45 a.m. on Friday, December 6, 1889, in the presence of several friends and holding Varnia's hand. Davis's body lay in state at the New Orleans City Hall from December 7th to 11th. Davis's funeral was one of the largest held in the South. Over 200,000 mourners were estimated to have attended. The coffin was transported on a 2-mile journey to the cemetery in a modified 4-wheeled caisson to emphasize his role as a military hero. Davis was buried according to the Episcopal rites, and a brief eulogy was pronounced by Bishop John Nicholas Gallagher. After Davis's funeral, various southern states requested to be the final resting site for Davis's remains. Varnia decided that Davis should be buried in Richmond, which she saw as the appropriate resting place for dead Confederate heroes. She chose Hollywood Cemetery. In May 1893, Davis's remains traveled from New Orleans to Richmond. Along the way, the train stopped at various cities, receiving military honors and visits from governors, and the coffin was allowed to lie in state in 3 state capitals: Montgomery, Alabama, Atlanta, Georgia, and Raleigh, North Carolina. When Davis was reburied, his children were reinterred on the site as Varnia requested, and when Varnia died in 1906, she was buried beside him. And now, another forgotten history. Clara Clemens, born on June 8, 1874, was the only surviving child of the renowned American writer Mark Twain, also known as Samuel Clemens, and his wife Olivia Langdon Clemens. Clara grew up in a literary household, surrounded by some of the greatest minds of the 19th and early 20th centuries. As a child, she was closely linked to her father's work, with Mark Twain often writing letters to her and seeking her opinions. Throughout her life, Clara's relationship with her father was a deep and affectionate one, and she often accompanied him on his travels around the world. Mark Twain's influence on Clara's life was profound, both personally and professionally, and she was dedicated to preserving and sharing his legacy after his death. Clara Clemens herself became known for her work as a singer and performer. She pursued a career in music, becoming a trained soprano. She performed across the United States and Europe, making her debut in 1899 in New York City. Clara also made recordings for the Victrola phonograph, contributing to the cultural scene of her time. Despite her fame as a performer, Clara was also deeply interested in literature and the arts, and she remained engaged with her father's legacy throughout her life. Her role as the custodian of Twain's works became increasingly important after his passing, and she worked diligently to ensure his literary contributions were preserved and honored. In addition to her career as a performer and her literary work, Clara was active in various charitable causes, including those related to children's welfare. She also became known for her personal letters and writings about her father, which provided intimate glimpses into the Clemens family life. Clara Clemens outlived her famous father by many decades, passing away on November 19, 1962. Her legacy as a talented artist, as well as the daughter of one of America's greatest writers, continues to be recognized and celebrated in the context of both literary and cultural history. Join us next week when we talk with Thomas Jefferson, who was an American founding father who served as the 3rd President of the United States. Until then, take care.